1 Peter chapter 4, starting at verse 1. For as much then as Christ hath suffered, for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. Who shall give account of him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead? For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober, and watch unto prayer. And above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as God's stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. And on their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God, and if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God? And if the righteousness scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator. The title of the message this morning is Sufferings. Sufferings. And in view of an introduction, when life is easy, we drift into carelessness and sin. But suffering changes our values and our goals. The fiery trial in a furnace that purifies the gold and allows God to remove the dross. There in Psalm 66:10 says, "For thou, O God, hast proved us and hast tried us as silver is tried." So we know that when metal is placed in the furnace and the dross comes to the top, that once it cools and you put it back into the furnace, the dross comes to the top again. That's why you always see on gold and silver 99.9% pure, because it cannot get all of it out. So neither can we get all of it out. Not in this life. We're going to have the imperfections. Just like silver and gold, no matter how many times you put it back into the fire, it's going to still have the dross, and you're still going to have to skim it off the top. So here's what suffering does for us. And I broke this down into 3 points. And as we go through these, I would encourage you to try to see if any at all these fit you this morning. Because we all suffer. In one way or another, we all suffer. So the first point this morning is that suffering purifies the saint. Suffering purifies the saint. It identifies us with Christ, there in verse 1. He suffered for us, and that He might save us from sin. As we suffer for Him and with Him, we learn to hate sin and love Him more. The longer we stay in this world and in His presence, we should, if you haven't already, become to hate sin more and more every day. Peter encourages them to have the mind of Christ and to realize that their identification with Christ means victory over sin. So if you identify yourself with Christ, you can have the victory. This is Peter's version of Romans 6 that talks about freedom from sin and the Christian being under grace and the law of the Spirit. You get a chance to go in and read Romans chapter 6. Secondly, it reminds us that life is short. We take life for granted until we have to suffer. And then our values change. And people look at life differently. Everybody sees life in a different aspect. How foolish for the Christian to waste the rest of the time by running with the world and sinning. It's a waste of time because we have a short time when it really comes down to it. There is a better way than running with the world. Rather than live in the will of sinful men, we must live in the will of God. And if we're living in the will of God, don't make sense, but we're going to suffer. And we're going to suffer many different things because we're trying to live in the will of God. Next, it points ahead of God's judgment there in verses 4 through 6. And I'm not going to go back and read it all again, but you can later today or this week. A Christian lives either according to the judgment of men or the judgment of God. So what are you living for? Are you living for the judgment of man, or are you living for the judgment of God? The world thinks it is strange that we no longer join them in sin and they speak evil of us. They want us to do the same things they do because then it makes them feel better. It makes them feel good if we join in with them. They know we're a Christian now, and they want to feel better about themselves, so they want us to join in and do the things that they're doing. But their evil speaking does not upset us. God will judge them someday. They will give an account to Him. Sometimes we get aggravated. We get aggravated at the government. We get aggravated at our communities. We get aggravated at what happened Tuesday. We get aggravated with all that. But we know in the end that God is going to judge that. He's going to judge them. They think it's funny, like I said the other day. They think it's funny and they think it's a big joke. They may have won a victory, they think. But they're only causing themselves to go further and further down into the depths of hell. Verse 6 may be paraphrased this way. I'll read verse 6 there again, and we'll paraphrase a little bit here. For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. So it can be paraphrased this way. There are people now dead physically, but alive with God in the Spirit, who were judged by the world. So some of them that's gone before us have been judged by the world, but God is their judge, and they are with Him. So it is better to suffer for Christ and go to be with God than to follow the world and be lost. There is no connection, if you may have read, between verse 6 and chapter 3, verse 9 and 20, nor is there any suggestion of a second chance for the lost after death. Now we'll go in there and read chapter 3 and verse 19 and 20 there. It says, by which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, which sometimes were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. They didn't get a second chance, when Christ preached to them. And He preached from Abraham's bosom, and that great gulf fixed. He preached to them. He preached to the ones that were in Abraham's bosom. The saints there that were the Old Testament saints. That's where they went. And they were in there, and He preached to them, and He declared to them, I am the Messiah. I am the one you've been waiting on. He told the same thing to the ones that were in hell. He said, I am the one that you should have believed in. You should have listened to Noah for 120 years while I preached that I was coming. And you didn't, and now here you are. Now, I don't know what exactly Christ's words were, but I'm sure that they were to the extent to let them know they could have been saved. But they didn't listen. Noah was preparing the ark for 120 years, and he preached every day because they showed up every day. They made fun, they laughed, they carried on, committed all acts of sin. And Noah knew their end. They wouldn't listen. It's important that Christians arm themselves with the same attitude toward the world, sin, and suffering that Jesus had while on earth. If we face suffering without a spiritual attitude, suffering will make us bitter rather than purify us. So we have to, even in our suffering, try to lay waste the bitterness. We have to understand that we'll never suffer the way Christ suffered. We'll never endure what Christ endured. The second point this morning is suffering unifies the church. There in verse 7 through 11. Peter repeats the exhortation, be sober. Be sober, which means serious-minded. We can find the same words there in chapter 1, verse 13 and chapter 5 and verse 8. I'll read chapter 5 and verse 8 here. It says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Be sober. Be serious. Have a serious mind about what's going on. He reminds them that Christ is coming soon. And in the midst of suffering, saints have responsibilities to one another. Look at verse 8. Not verse 8. Verse 4 of chapter 5. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. Prayer is one of them. So is fervent love. As we talked about this morning, the word fervent here means stretched out. We need to stretch our love out as far as we can. Christian love never reaches a breaking point. So cold. You would think that would be true. It is true, but I think some of us stretch it too far. Becomes a breaking point. If that wasn't the case, then there would be less divorces today. It is bad enough when the world accuses the saints ought not to accuse one another. There's a lesson there to be learned. Love will help cover the sins of the saints. And many times the issue is, if you want to point your finger at one of the saints, then you better look at your own self. And make sure that you're in good graces with God and that you're not doing the same thing that the one you're accusing is doing. But no, we want to say, oh no, we're okay. There's nothing wrong with us. It's the other person that's had the problem. See, love does not cleanse sin. But it does cover sin in that we do not go around talking about other people's sins. The age-old adage is, if you point your finger at somebody, you got three pointing back at you. You're 3 times as guilty as the person you're pointing the finger at. Now, we talked a little bit about these things this morning. Peter exhorts these Christians to open their homes as well as their hearts. Christians' hospitality is a forgotten blessing in the modern church, and we need to restore it. The attitude of people today is, I don't want to be bothered. Christians alike. Don't want to be bothered. Finally, Christians need to serve the Lord in spite of persecution. We already know we're going to be persecuted. In fact, I always said, if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, then we won't be persecuted. See, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, then you're going to receive persecution. That's a sure sign of it. So in spite of persecution, ministering their gifts as good stewards of God, God's many-sided, manifold grace, and manifold also means varied, many-colored, and variegated. So God's grace can meet any need to match any color that might come to our life. God gives us the gifts and the strength to use all things for His glory. So we have to remember everything that we're doing. Everything that we're doing in our lives, everything we're doing in our homes, everything we're doing in the church especially is for the glory of God. We're not doing it to bring attention upon ourselves. We're not doing it to get the pat on the back, even though a pat on the back's nice. It's nice to hear you're doing a good job from time to time. That's not what it's all about. It's all about serving God. If everyone had the attitude that the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, was to be used for the glory of God, you'd have people standing in the other room if they would come to that understanding. So He gives us the gifts, and He gives us the strength for His glory. Not for your own, but for His glory. Thirdly, suffering glorifies the Lord. Suffering glorifies the Lord. Now you may say, how in the world does my suffering glorify the Lord? First of all, there in verse 12, we can expect trials. It says, Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. So the first thing that happens is when we suffer, we want to ask the question, why? Why do we suffer? We are already told to expect trials. We're already told. Trials are not strangers to the Christian life. They are to be expected. Trials that are part of the will of God are not warnings that we are disobeying Him. They are God's tools for perfecting His own. That's what He's trying to do. He's trying to perfect us. He's trying to turn us into the image of His dear Son, who is perfect. Now, we won't reach that goal in this life, but we should sure strive to do that. The image there is that we are to strive to please God in everything we do His will, so others may see that in us. Isn't that what they've seen in Christ? We've said it before. There in Isaiah it says that He was uncomely, that one would desire Him. But yet, as Brother Ray had pointed out last week, I think it was, that Satan was beautiful. Every precious stone and jewel that was so radiant was a reflection of Satan when he was created. He was created the most beautiful being ever. And what is it that man desires? Beauty. We desire beauty. We desire new things. But Jesus was a Jew. Normal. Able to hide in a crowd. And nobody special physically. And that's not what they followed. They didn't follow the physical attraction of Jesus Christ. They followed the spiritual part of Christ that flowed through him, that radiated from him the true Word of God. So in verse 13 and 14 there, Peter says we need to rejoice in our trials. I know that sounds strange, but we need to rejoice. Be thankful for them. Philippians 1:29 says, "For unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake." Philippians 3:10, "That I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death." So the suffering we endure now is but a prelude or introduction to the glory that we will share at his coming. Look at Romans chapter 8. I always like this. Romans chapter 8 and verse 18. I always thought Paul was a hillbilly. Because he said, "For I reckon," the only person I ever know to heard say reckon was a hillbilly. "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Or to us. The glory that will be revealed to us cannot be compared with the sufferings. There's no amount of sufferings on this earth that you'll ever endure that will compare to what we're going to have in glory. None. Never. So if you suffered or you're suffering, just think about that. It'll be someday in glory, won't it? Furthermore, the Spirit of God rests with refreshing power. In the literal translation there, verse 14, that is the literal translation of verse 14, upon the suffering believer. Verse 14 says, "If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified." Turn to Daniel chapter 3. We see here in Daniel chapter 3, the 3 Hebrew children went into the fiery furnace. They had faith that God could deliver them. Daniel chapter 3 and verse 19. "Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their own other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men bound in the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Now we know that to be Jesus was in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language would speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God than that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now there's a lesson there to be learned. Many preachers today are preaching that, we're supposed to submit to Biden, to the President of the United States. These men didn't submit. They refused to submit. They were rewarded by God. In the book of Esther, we see the same thing. Not only did these men believe that God would deliver them, but he walked with them. If we go back, we see here in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said unto the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, listen to what they said. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were so determined that they literally told King Nebuchadnezzar, whether we live or die, God will deliver us. Yeah. And he did. Now back at our text there, we do not be ashamed in trials. That's what verse 15 and 16 is telling us. See, Roman law required each citizen to pledge his loyalty to the emperor. Now, that's what some of our Baptist preachers want us to do, submit to the emperor, the king, the president. And they think it's our duty to do that. But yet we see all through Scriptures that it's not. Once a year, the citizens would put a pinch of incense on the proper altar and say, "Caesar is Lord." But the Christian confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord. In chapter 3 and verse 15, believers refuse to bow before Caesar. Sometimes the Roman official would write the name of Christ on the ground or on a wall and ask the Christian to spit on it. If the Christian refused, he or she would be arrested, tried, and perhaps killed, if not thrown into the dungeon for later persecution. By bearing the name of Christ or Christian, they were put to shame before their friends. But what a glorious name to bear! It is the name higher than any other. Then in verse 17 and 18, we see witness in trials. We need to be a witness even in our trials and tribulations. No matter what the government does to it, we need to stay true and be witnesses. If God sends trials to the church now, this is the evidence that He will judge the lost. He will someday judge the lost. We have our trials now and our glory later. The lost have their glory now and their suffering later. The only heaven the lost sinner will know is on earth today. God begins His judgment at the house, the church. In Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 6, He says, "Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and being at my sanctuary, then they began at the ancient men which were before the house." If persecution for the name of Christ is but the beginning of trials, then what will happen when it comes time for the lost to be judged? What will happen? The righteous, the believers, are saved with difficulty. Verse 18, "And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? What hope is there for the ungodly?" Proverbs 11:31 says, "Behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner." Recompense here means they will be rewarded, given compensation. And then in verse 19, the last verse there, "Commit yourself to God." It says, "Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to Him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator." The word for commit used here is a banking term. It refers to the act of leaving an amount on deposit for safekeeping, commit to one's charge. It ties in beautiful with the gold illustration in chapter 1 and verse 7. If you want to turn there. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7. It says there that the trial of your faith being much more precious than gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. God sends a fiery trial. Now you have to listen to this. God sends a fiery trial to burn away the dross. And we commit ourselves to Him for the safekeeping, knowing that He cannot fail us. Remember, no matter what our suffering is, we can be sure that God will pay interest on our deposit. But note that we commit ourselves in doing good. That is, we commit ourselves to God as we obey His word. This is a daily and hourly surrender, living to please Him and serving others. And lastly, Christians will go through fiery trials before Christ returns. We need not ask why, because we know it's going to happen. Why do we go through it? For the cause of Christ, for the will of God. The world's situation will not get better. It will not get better. Even though some of my Baptist brethren believe that, they're pessimistic. Or optimistic, They're optimistic. I'm not optimistic when it comes to this. Because, see, and I explained this to somebody, it's not that I'm negative. It's not that. It may appear that I'm negative, but it's not that I'm negative. I'm realistic. See, there's a big difference in being realistic and being negative. I understand it. I see it. I can feel it. I can view it. I've been 72 years in this world. You would think that I would know a little bit about what's going on, right? So I'm realistic in the fact. Attitude toward Christians will not improve. The world has always hated the name of Christ and will continue to hate it. If we identify ourselves with the name of Christ, the world will hate us. Look at John chapter 15. John chapter 15, I'm going to read this and then I'm going to close here. But John chapter 15 and 18, this is from Christ Himself speaking to us. He says, if the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were not of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. But all these things will they do unto you for my name's sake, because they know not him that sent me. If we compromise, we will escape persecution. But we will also miss the blessing and glory of sharing Christ's sufferings. May God bless His word to your heart today.